This is what a lot of people watching this show don't yet know, right? They haven't yet realized. If you look ahead, the scale and speed of change that is going to come through British society as a result of migration is going to be something on the scale that nobody in this country has ever seen before. Basically, you've been lied to by left and right. Britain is forecast to see the largest absolute increase in the number of Muslims of all European nations. So we're going to go from 6%. We're going to go up to somewhere around. If you don't play by the rules that govern our society, you're not welcome in our society. Nobody in Westminster is seriously talking about those questions. In fact, the only debates that are happening, Andrew, are the debates on podcasts like this one. I would be amazed if Keir Starmer did not know that Axel Rudikabana, I've been told by counter-terrorism officials, the only person with a response that seems to be cutting through is Nigel Farage.
Could Nigel Farage be Prime Minister?
And there's a revolution that's starting in this country. Unless we change course, this is going to be the biggest demographic and cultural transformation Europe's ever seen.
Hello, fellow heretics. Thanks so much for watching this content. I couldn't do it without you. I just wanted to quickly ask you to please like and subscribe. I see that only a tiny percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel. Please click subscribe because it will boost this content to the rest of the world and will also help me to continue convincing the best guests to grace the heretics stage. I want to talk about how the tide might be turning on mass immigration, but let's get to grips first with the basics. So what is the immigration rate in the UK? What's going wrong?
So I think the UK basically is going through an extreme experiment that is being led by politicians on both the left and the right, both Labour and the Tories, who over the last 20 years have basically opened the floodgates, have imposed on the British people a policy that very few people in this country actually support and which is now making Britain poorer. I think the evidence now shows that, more divided, less prosperous, and I think unless we get our arms around this problem and stop it and address it and end the period of mass uncontrolled immigration, we're going to have enormous problems.
So I think I asked you this last time and I still can't get my head around it. For whose benefit is this rapid mass immigration?
Yeah, so firstly, I mean, the scale of the changes we need to think about. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've had 2.5 million people migrate into the UK. That's equivalent to about two cities the size of Birmingham in 2 years. We've got much of that migration now, thanks to Boris Johnson and the Tories, is coming from outside of Europe. So about 86% of all migration into Britain is now coming from outside of Europe, from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Pakistan. And a lot of folks in Westminster will say, well, this is good for the economy, but actually only about 16 to 18% of people who are coming into Britain now, 16 to 18% are coming in on high-skilled worker visas. So you think, well, who the hell's coming in? Who else is coming in? Students, the relatives of workers, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. So what basically is happening is mass migration is pushing all of us into managed decline. It's costing us economically. I've shared this information widely on Substack, but even the Office for Budget Responsibility now accepts, which is a kind of, woke government department, now accepts that mass immigration is making us poorer. So for every low-wage, low-skill migrant coming into Britain, it's costing the taxpayers watching this show between £150,000 and £1 million over their lifetime. So what I'm trying to say, to be clear, if you're watching this from Britain or you're watching this from Europe, wondering what the hell's going on in Britain, basically you've been lied to by left and right, and you've been lied to by Boris Johnson and the Tories, and you're now being gaslit by Keir Starmer and the Labour government, because we don't have a high-skill migration policy. We have mass, uncontrolled, unprecedented, low-wage, low-skill migration, which is making us poorer and is culturally incompatible. I would argue we are importing masses of people from radically different cultures, from radically different societies. And what that is doing, as serious scholars like Robert Putnam at Harvard and others have shown, rapid demographic change on the scale that we have in Britain is pushing us into a low trust society, a divided society where people hunker down and they turn away from their neighbours because they don't know their neighbours anymore. And that's basically what's happening in Britain. Nobody in Westminster really wants to face up to this reality, except to some people outside of the big two parties that we'll come back to. But this is being imposed on everybody because it benefits big business. Let's be clear about who's benefiting. It benefits global corporations who want masses of cheap labor because it keeps their costs low and their profits high. It's also benefiting the kind of radically progressive, woke, new elite in London, Oxford, and Cambridge because they want to feel good about themselves. They want to have that sense of virtue, that sense of moral righteousness, and they won't live with the negative effects of this policy because they tend to live in neighborhoods that are not affected by it. So those are the big beneficiaries. Everybody else, outside of big business and let's say the 15% elite minority, everybody else suffers. Everybody else pays the costs of mass uncontrolled immigration, both economic and cultural, and everybody else has to deal with disproportionate rates of crime among illegal migrants and new arrivals. They have to deal with weaker social cohesion, with the breakdown of our social fabric. They have to deal with issues like the grooming gang scandal across much of northern England and many other areas. And they have to deal with the growing signs of segregation and sectarianism in our society. So this policy isn't working. That, by the way, we'll get onto this, I'm sure, but that is why British politics now is in the most unpredictable, chaotic, volatile moment that it's ever been on record. And that is why we've not only just gone from a massive Conservative majority to a massive Labour majority in 5 years, but that is why anything is possible in 2029.
Wow. I mean, 20 years ago, there were very few centrists or moderates who were radically anti-immigration or concerned about immigration or outspokenly against immigration. When did that? Was there a certain moment that changed that? What happened for you? What made you go, hang on a minute? I mean, did you used to think it might, or maybe it's racist, or like a lot of us did?
So I understand why people think conversations like the one that we're having is somehow problematic or provocative, or that the things I say they might construe as being racist, because that word is meaningless now. What's happened is the elite class has expanded that word to mean basically any views around migration that they disagree with are now considered racist or xenophobic. I come at this from the point of view of evidence in terms of what we can see is actually happening. I also come at this from the point of view of what I believe makes a cohesive, sustainable national community, which is a shared set of values, shared sense of history or collective memory, shared sense of identity. And a bit like a garden, you want to have that nation protected by strong borders so that people within that nation feel safe and secure. I don't think mass uncontrolled immigration serves any of those things. I think it undermines the very essence of what a national community is. It undermines a shared sense of identity. It undermines a shared sense of history because people don't have the same history. It undermines a shared sense of culture because we're importing people from radically different, and I would argue in some cases, inferior cultures that have not produced the kinds of things that Western civilization and Western culture has produced over recent centuries. And I think now the evidence from the Netherlands to Denmark to Britain is that this is also making us poorer and less prosperous. So why should we stand for it? Why should we not challenge it and critique it? That doesn't make you a racist for pointing that out. That makes you somebody who is concerned about your nation and what comes at this from the point of view of evidence. If you go back 20 years with, say, New Labour and Tony Blair, many people then were deeply uncomfortable about the arrival of mass immigration as a policy. It began in 2004, really, when Tony Blair opened up the doors. That saw net migration, the number of people coming in minus the number of people leaving, that saw net migration reach around 200,000, which at the time was considered to be a really big number. If you look at where we are today, net migration recently just hit almost 1 million, which, is unprecedented. We've had more migration over the last 5 years than we've had really over the last 1,000, if you add it all up. And this is only going to accelerate. This is what a lot of people watching this show don't yet know, right? They haven't yet realized. If you look ahead at what the government's planning with its forecasts, so, we've just had 2.5 million people migrate into Britain over the last couple of years. We've had about 4 million since the COVID pandemic, most of those low-skilled, low-wage workers. Now look at where we're going. By the year 2036, according to the government's own forecasts, we're going to have another 6.5 million people being added to Britain's population, which is about 6 cities the size of Birmingham.
Or entire countries. 6.5 million people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's basically the best part of another London in just about a decade. At the same time, as immigration is now the only driver of our population growth, because our fertility rate has collapsed, our birth rate has collapsed. It's now at 1.4. The replacement level is 2.1, and it's forecast to drop to 1.3 by the end of this century. So immigration, what I'm saying is it's not only changing the country you see today, but basically over the next decade, the scale and speed of change that is going to come through British society as a result of migration from mainly outside of European nations is going to be something on a scale that nobody in this country has ever seen before. So what you're seeing now is just the start of an immigration explosion. Now, the questions that raises around what does it mean for housing? What does it mean for infrastructure? What does it mean for economic growth? We don't have any economic growth currently. What does it mean for social cohesion? What does it mean for our shared sense of identity, history, and values? Nobody in Westminster is seriously talking about those questions. In fact, the only debates that are happening, Andrew, are the debates on podcasts like this one, because even the BBC and others are terrified of really having long-form discussions about this issue because they don't want to get into it because it is so seismic when you actually look at the numbers involved.
Yeah, do you remember, I often think about this, that Stacey Dooley documentary about 13 years ago on the BBC where she was worried about what was happening to Luton. You couldn't make, presumably in those last 13, 14 years, it's 10 times that in terms of new people coming to this country. That was about Islam, that documentary. And now you wouldn't even be able to make that document. The BBC, can you imagine them making that documentary today?
Well, if you look at where we're going in terms of, say, Muslim migration in Britain, or the evolving, or the growth of the existing Muslim population in the country, if you take a pretty centrist, I would even say quite liberal think tank like the Pew Research Centre, they have shown that between today and 2050, Britain is forecast to see the largest absolute increase in the number of Muslims of all European nations between today and 2050. So we're going to go from, I think, a share of our population, which is Muslim, of around 6%. We're going to go up to somewhere around 15%. Sweden is going to go to about 35%, France to about 31%, Germany as well. So the demographic trend in Europe, the trends that are going to radically transform European societies unless we change course. And we can change course because this is a conscious policy that's being pursued by political elites. We could make a different choice if we wanted. But unless we change course, this is going to be the biggest demographic and cultural transformation Europe's ever seen.
Did you know that in the UK, people are being arrested for what they post online? That's why I use today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, your shield against the creeping control over your digital life. With Surfshark, your online activity is completely hidden. No one, not your internet provider, hackers, or even governments, can track what you do online. Your IP address, disguised. Your location, masked. And does the internet feel like it's missing half its content? From censored news articles to blocked streaming services, governments and corporations limit what you can see. Surfshark unlocks content from over 100 countries so you can browse the web like a citizen of the world. One subscription covers unlimited devices. Plus, Surfshark has a strict no logs policy. Your data isn't logged. It stays yours and yours alone. And here's the cherry on top. Surfshark Alert. It's like a watchdog for your digital identity, scanning for leaked personal information and keeping you ahead of data breaches. Right now, viewers of this channel can get an unbeatable price for an extra 4 months and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Just go to surfshark.com/heretics. Don't risk your safety. Sign up to Surfshark VPN. Are we at a point now where we're seeing MPs now in Parliament emboldened, Muslim MPs, asking for, as you've seen, blasphemy laws, asking, defending first cousin marriage, Mohsin Ali holding up the Palestine, Allahu Akbar. These are now British politicians. They're embedded in here. Are we getting close to the point of no return? And are we going to see more and more of this?
I think we're seeing two things. I think the first thing we're seeing is the complete breakdown of the argument that multiculturalism is working. I don't think any serious frontline politician would now make the argument that multiculturalism in Britain has been a success story, with the exception of, let's say, the likes of Sadiq Khan, who maybe are, people might agree with me, are coming at this more from a virtue signaling position than an evidence-based position. What we can see at the recent general election is the rise of sectarianism, MPs being elected simply on the issue of Gaza, and I would argue anti-Israel, if not anti-Semitic positions. We've got communal violence in places like Leicester and Hare Hills, other parts of Britain. We've had the Southport incident, the mainstreaming of ethnic gang violence. We've got very clear evidence that some communities in Britain are not integrating at all into the wider national community. We've got lots of survey evidence that suggests about 40% of British Muslims would like a Muslim-only political party in Britain. We've got worrying evidence of anti-Semitism within British Muslim communities. I don't think anybody can look at Britain and say multiculturalism is working as a state policy. So that's the first thing I think we've discovered, especially since the 7th of October, but also over the last 10 years. The second thing I think we're now beginning to grasp, even though we can't say it out loud, is that we are going to have a very big challenge in this country from the rise and growth of Islam, but also Islamism within our society, that is going to be increasingly pressuring our institutions and our political leaders to bend our way of life and our values around a very different set of values and religion. Now, we've got glimmers of that. The attempt to take Michaela Free School to court because they refused to allow children to pray at lunchtimes. We've got glimmers of that around what the MPs have been doing in the House of Commons. And we've had glimmers of that around the grooming gang scandal and the debate over cousin marriage. My assumption is this is just the start of a much bigger national debate about the extent to which Islam can be integrated and made compatible with British ways of life, and what we are willing to do in order to make it clear that we only have one economic, legal, judicial, and social system, if you like, in this society, and we're not going to tolerate parallel systems in this society. That debate is about to begin, and it's already underway in the Netherlands. It's already underway in Germany. But over the next 5 years, that debate is going to become much more central to mainstream British political life.
I interviewed an ex-Hasidic Jew, Izzy Posen, recently, and you can't compare. They're almost incomparable because it's not a violent community, and also rather than being a colonizer, they're exclusive. They don't want more people in. They don't want, But there are parallels. There's some parallels, which is it's a high control authoritarian group in some respects. And he said, like, the stuff that goes on there, tax issues, their own separate silos, economics, education. He's like, that's pretty mad. And they've got like 30,000 people in the country, Hasidic Jews. Imagine if they were 4 or 5 million. I mean, that's what we're dealing with Islam right now. I suppose the question is, to what extent are the 4 or 5 million Muslims in this country as religious or as extreme as the 30 or 40,000 Hasidic Jews? I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the first and second generation British Muslims are more religious than their parents and grandparents. This was an argument I tried to make in the aftermath of the Southport atrocities, where people said, well, what has this got to do with migration? I said, actually, it's got a lot to do with migration because, firstly, the family were from Rwanda. Secondly, the boy was first generation. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that first generation younger people continue to take on the cultural behaviors and values and practices of their parents, and that they don't fully integrate to the same degree. And let's wait and see what happens with that case. But I thought it had a lot to do with the migration story. But so I think the broader debate that we are going to have is how do you build an integrated Britain and a successful, cohesive Britain? What concerns me more than anything is that we are running an extreme policy of mass immigration while not doing anything on integration at all. Now, there's a philosophical question here, which is, can you ever really integrate a society while running this level of migration? And some might say you can't and it's impossible. But where I think we need to go now is we need to firstly break down the case that is supporting this extreme policy of mass migration. So we need to basically end this policy. I would argue that we need an immediate freeze on all non-essential migration. And from thereafter, we need net migration to be at maximum around 50,000 a year. And it needs to be high-skill migration, genuinely high-skill migration from culturally compatible nations. That's what I would argue. So let's prioritize high-skill migration from the Anglosphere, and let's downgrade low-skill, low-wage migration from elsewhere, which ironically is what conservatives at one point said they were going to do. Parallel to that, we need a much more robust integration strategy that does things like breaking up schools that are clearly segregated along the lines of ethnicity and religion. That makes it clear we're not going to have parallel societies running in Britain. We're not going to allow things like cousin marriage. We're not going to allow things like Sharia courts. We're not going to allow things like preachers and mosques mainstreaming Islamism. And if they do, they'll be shut down. And basically a system that communicates and makes it very clear to people that if you don't play by the rules that govern our society, you're not welcome in our society. Deporting people who arrive illegally, 150,000 on the small boats, about 1.2 million people in the country illegally, according to the Pew Research Center. And leaving things like the European Convention on Human Rights so we can actually control our borders and remove people who break our laws, like the 11,000 foreign national offenders who are in UK prisons at the moment. Look, not everybody who's watching this show will agree with me. Some will think, well, that's quite a hard line. Others will say, okay, that makes sense to me. The point I'm trying to make is European nations over the next 25 years or so, 25 to 50 years, are going to have a choice. They can either lose themselves or they can build what we might call a fortress Britain, a Britain that actually prioritizes the safety and the security of its own people who've been paying into the collective pot their whole lives, or it can not do that. And if it doesn't do that, the end result will be more chaos and division and protests and riots like we saw over the summer. And my view is we need to actually take the security and safety of the British people. We need to start there and work forward.
What do you imagine is going through Keir Starmer's head when he is confronted with what is quite clearly a blasphemy law about the desecration of the Quran, and he then says, yes, I quite agree? Because this is a learned man, I imagine, Keir Starmer. He must know that, hang on, this is a bit of a slippery slope. So what's going through his mind?
I don't think Keir Starmer really does think that much at all, in the sense that I think Starmer is a classic progressive. I think he's a radical progressive. We know where Starmer is on a lot of issues. We know about his past and the cases that he presided over. We know where he was on Brexit. He wanted a second referendum. He wanted people to essentially be forced to remain in the European Union. I would be amazed if Keir Starmer did not know about the revelation that Axel Rudakabana, the alleged murderer of those little girls, had downloaded Islamist literature and had produced ricin or been on his way to producing ricin. I would be amazed if Keir Starmer had not known that while he was deriding much of the country as far-right thugs. I've been told by counter-terrorism officials and former ministers, I'll leave it there, that both Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper would have been told almost immediately after that knowledge, after that information became known. And the reason I'm saying that is I think the most revealing part of Keir Starmer's political story and who he is as a politician was in the aftermath of Southport. I think what you saw there, that very authoritarian top-down response, everyone here is a far-right thug. I'm viewing this issue through the lens of criminality. There are no legitimate concerns here about migration. Essentially, that's what he said. And then months later, when he set out his priorities for his Labour government, even then he didn't prioritise migration, even though it's the number one issue in the country. And I think all of this adds up to a guy that just doesn't understand, doesn't get how normal people think and feel. Radical progressives will always reach for free speech clampdowns, for free expression clampdowns, because they cannot tolerate challenges and opinions and beliefs that are counter to those that they hold. So we know Labour were trying to work with Kamala Harris and the Democrats to quote unquote kill Elon Musk's Twitter. We know that Keir Starmer would be probably quite receptive to expanding definitions of Islamophobia in order to shut down legitimate criticism of Islam. We know that Yvette Cooper, his Home Secretary, wants to make it easier to record non-crime hate incidents, the Orwellian measures that are used to basically try and control speech and expression. All of this stuff is now mainstream on the left of politics because it is about narrowing down and controlling the public square and not allowing people to express any opposition to that. And I think Islamophobia is the next big debate within that. I think the term will be expanded. I suspect new laws will be introduced. For Labour, it makes sense because British Muslims are a massive part of their electoral coalition. They need to constantly prioritise identity politics. But the big loser in all of that will be our national community. Instead of appealing to tribal identity groups, we need leaders who rise above that and say, actually, we have a national system and a national story here, and we're not going to pander to identity grievances.
Does it wind you up thinking about, if we got to that point, let's say that Iran got to, and Lebanon, I believe, where the left teamed up with Islamism and Islamism took over, I get wound up thinking, I wouldn't be able to go up to Keir Starmer and say, look, mate, look what you've done, because it never works out. Do you know what I mean? Maybe it's a childish thing inside me. I want to say, I want to shake them and go what? Look what you're doing. Look what you've done. But they seem to be living in the cloud.
Well, there was a study recently that showed that people on the radical progressive left are just as authoritarian as people on the right can be. Sure. And what happens when they're confronted with evidence that challenges their beliefs, they tend to ignore it. And I think you see that with the Labour Party. I mean, if you try and make the argument that what they are creating through mass immigration, by failing to control the borders, by pandering to, let's say, radical, if not extreme groups, they're creating a very divided, low-trust society. That's exactly what New Labour did, by the way. Much of this goes back to New Labour and the legal architecture that they put in to Britain's political system. A lot of this, I think, goes back to the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, the Supreme Court, New Labour's kind of insistence that supranational institutions like the European Union and others should always dominate and be supreme over our national law and over ourselves as a sovereign, self-guiding nation. And if you look at the legacy of things like the Human Rights Act or the European Convention on Human Rights, which has a longer lineage, that's why we can't control our borders. So we're now getting at the point where neither Labour nor the Conservatives will commit to overturning any of that stuff. And so by extension, they won't commit to controlling our own borders. I mean, the only people who will are Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. So that is the clearest dividing line that we now have in British politics between what you might call the uniparty that is indistinguishable on a lot of these issues and Farage and Reform.
Regarding Farage and Reform, are we seeing a turning point, particularly among the youth?
I think we're seeing a turning point in this country more generally. I think we are on the cusp of a full-blown political realignment in Britain of the kind that America has just seen, but which has been building in this country for the last 15 years. So like my sort of bird's eye view of British politics is that, with Farage and the UK Independence Party in the 2000s leading up to the Brexit referendum, you kind of had the beginning of this realignment. You then had the Brexit vote, which sort of brought it to the surface, made it unavoidable. Everybody realized that, oh, crikey, there are millions of people in this country that do not support the status quo, that do not support the elite consensus, that want a radically different vision of who we are. The Conservatives at that point had a unique opportunity to lean into that, like Donald Trump has done. They completely fumbled that. They diluted Brexit. They softened it up. They pushed the pedal down on mass immigration. They put it on steroids. They didn't really give a monkeys about the British people. They did what they want to do. That's what Tories always do. And they lost the realignment. Now, the story might have ended there. But actually, what happened in 2024 is the British people came back to the table and they said, we're not quite done with this realignment. We're going to give Nigel Farage 4 million votes. We're going to give him what he's not had before, 5 MPs in Parliament. We're going to give him a voice in the national political arena. And I think actually we're going to see how far we can push this thing and try and reshape the whole system. So as we're talking now in December 24, what have you got in the polling? You've got Reform on 25%. So they're up 10 points on the election in July. You've got Labour on 26%. You've got the Tories on 23%. You've got a two-party system becoming a multi-party system. And you've got millions of people out there saying, I don't want left or right anymore. I don't want Labour and the Tories. I don't want this society that I see around me. I don't want this managed decline. I don't want all of this immigration. I don't want soft on crime policies. I don't want two-tier policing. I don't want an economy that just works for London. I would quite like to live in a country that I respect, that keeps me safe, that I'm proud of, and that puts my interests first. That is why Farage is back at the forefront of British politics. That is why he is now the most influential politician, I would argue, of his generation. I think Reform, if they get it right, you know, all political realignments are about demand and supply. You have to have the demand, but you have to have a party that can supply that with a credible, coherent, compelling message. I think if Reform get that bit right and they kind of lock into this demand, I think the next 5 years could deliver a political earthquake on a scale this country has never seen really since Labour replaced the Liberals. I mean, I think Reform could go further than the SDP, the Social Democrats in the 1980s, which came close to replacing the Labour Party. I actually think Farage and Reform could go much further because we are in this civilizational moment. And by that, I mean, you and I aren't even talking about policy, really. What we're talking about is a sense that we both have, and I think many viewers will have it too. We have a sense that our civilization here is on the table, that we actually want to save a country that we both knew and loved, but which for different reasons, maybe we suspect is now beginning to, the survival of that country is beginning to be, you know, questioned and may not be guaranteed. And so for Reform, the big message I think that many people are sending by voting for it is actually, no, we want our country back. We want to save our country. And I think that's where Farage is getting a lot of his headwind.
He has support from Elon Musk, doesn't he? Is it true? Is Musk putting money? Is he giving him money? I've heard this. He wants to give him millions of dollars.
So all I can say is what Nigel Farage has said publicly, which is he's got a very direct relationship with both Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And I think his new party treasurer, Nick Candy, also has relationships with Elon Musk. I think the reason I think that Elon Musk thing is significant is because there are lots of people in America who have gone through the Trump rebellion, who are looking at the West generally, and lots of people in Europe too, by the way, who are looking at Britain and asking themselves the same question, which is, what the hell happened to this country I used to respect? And it's that sense that Britain's completely lost its way. I was in Hungary recently giving a talk to some students, undergraduate university students, who were laughing at what is happening in Britain, laughing at the state of our country, laughing at how we don't have control over our borders, laughing at how we've just allowed this policy of mass immigration with no real opposition. And Americans say the same. Americans say, well, you're the country of Magna Carta, you're the country of individual liberty, you're the country, you know, Winston Churchill and you know, the finest hour. What the hell's happened to you? That's the question people are asking. And I think so far, the only person with a response that seems to be cutting through is not Kemi Badenoch. and it's certainly not Keir Starmer. I do think actually it's Nigel Farage, who is at least able to say, well, if we want to turn this thing around, here's what we need to do. End the policy of mass immigration, end the highest tax burden that we've had for 50, 60 years, end this era of big debt and big borrowing, which is crippling us financially, push back against woke ideology, which is a divisive, un-British belief system that's now in our schools, universities, and public institutions, and push back against net zero, which is making energy more expensive and smashing the working class. I think if you start with just some of those policies, you're already starting with a program that is fundamentally different from the elite consensus in this country.
Is that why Keir Starmer the other day did mention immigration finally, very, very briefly, although then didn't seem to back that up at all?
Well, what Keir Starmer is trying to do is what Tony Blair tried to do 20 years earlier, which is kind of hold up his right flank in places like the Red Wall and Wales by saying, oh, I get it, we're gonna change things on immigration, or as Blair said, we're going to be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. It's all nonsense. I mean, Keir Starmer is basically gaslighting the country, because what Labour have done is, firstly, on illegal migration, they've said they're going to smash the gangs. But I've talked to so many people in the border security world. Nobody thinks Labour's policy is going to work. They've removed any active deterrent that we had with the Rwanda policy, which wasn't perfect, but it could have worked if we tightened it up a little bit. They've liberalized the immigration system. They've made it easier for families to reunite. They've made it easier for people from Afghanistan to migrate into the country. They really don't have any fundamental desire to dramatically lower net migration into the country. And as we saw with both Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer after Southport, fundamentally, they do not view opposition to mass immigration as legitimate, as being something they want to entertain. And I think where they're going to come unstuck, and we're going to see this over the next 2 years, reform will demolish Labour in large parts of the Red Wall. There is no way Kemi Badenoch and the Tories will ever be competitive in the Red Wall again. I will come back on this show and eat my next book, which I've done once before when I slightly underestimated Jeremy Corbyn's vote share.
How much of it did you eat?
A few pages.
Did you really?
Yeah, I did.
Does anything happen to you, like if you eat paper?
Not that I noticed. But the point here is I think reform will basically run through the Red Wall and Wales, and they'll smash Labour in those areas. And then they will do really well down the coast of England into Kent and Essex and that traditional UKIP territory. And you'll have these two flanks opening up where reform will be able to, I think, win easily upwards of 100 seats, if not more. And, the current polling, God, it's only been 5 months since the general election. And already, on the current numbers today, you've got a hung parliament with the Conservatives still weaker than they were in July, but reform on 100 plus seats. So anything's possible.
When you say anything's possible, could Nigel Farage be Prime Minister?
I think so, yeah. I think the key point about British politics, which very few people out there have realised, I've been writing about this for the last few years, we have levels of volatility in our system. By that, I mean record numbers of people changing their vote. Labour voters going Lib Dem, Conservative going Reform, some Labour going Reform, non-voters going wherever. We have record levels of volatility. So the tribal allegiances that guided British politics over the last 50, 60 years are gone. My dad voted Labour, his dad voted Labour. That stuff's all going. So when you have a system that is that fluid and chaotic and unpredictable, and then you have these enormous issues like mass immigration, which the established parties are refusing to do anything about, and you've got borders that are not being controlled and people not feeling safe, then yeah, anything is possible. And as I say, if you can mobilize that public demand and supply it with something that is credible and compelling and coherent, and you can professionalize that party, which I actually think Reform are starting to do, more than 100,000 party members, big money now starting to come in. And, I've been around that world for 15 years. I've seen it from the inside. the organisation that's going on now is in a completely different league from anything that happened with the Brexit Party or the UK Independence Party. When you start to see that, and you see the reaction on the ground, you start to think, actually, there's a revolution that's starting in this country, I think. Wow. And it's going to really, the next 5 years are going to be so, so unpredictable. Anything could happen.
You spoke at Reform National Conference. You've been becoming more political. What's going on there?
I'm desperately concerned about the state of our country. And I think everybody is asking themselves the same question, which is, what can I do to try and stop the disintegration, decline, and desecration of the national community that I really love? And how can we ensure that we can preserve and pass on the things that we've inherited from our ancestors, our parents and grandparents and their parents? And how can we pass those things on? Because I think we can all sense we're starting to lose some of that really important stuff. And, you can spend your life writing about what's happening and talking about it, which is important because that's about changing the culture, changing the public conversation. But I think also now, personally, I'm at a point in my life where that isn't enough, and I need to try and help change the direction that we're moving in. And as long as you're doing that for the right reasons and you feel that your actions are aligned with your values, then I think that's entirely acceptable. And, everybody wants to play a role and everybody wants to try and make a difference. I left the universities because I felt as though I couldn't really be a political campaigner, influencer, activist, commentator, whatever, while also teaching in some of our universities. I just felt like, unlike many of my friends on the left, I sort of felt like that wasn't really a good position to be in. And the response to that has been very positive. And through that, I've become increasingly convinced that actually we can change things. I genuinely think we can change the direction of this country radically over the next 5 years.
Do you know Farage quite well? What's he like?
I know him very well. I've got a lot of time for him. We've known each other for 15 years. What's he like? I think there are two Nigels. I think there's the showman, the TikTok star, the big speeches, the rebel, the disruptor, the insurgent, the sound bites. And then I think there's another Nigel who, if you get him one-on-one away from all of that, you quickly understand it's not just an act, that he desperately wants to change the direction of this country, and he's a man of integrity.
Is he nice?
And I think a lot of people who write about Farage don't really know Farage, and the people who do really know him know that behind the surface is somebody who really strongly cares about this country.
Is he a nice fella? Does he ask you about you when what's he on a personal level?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a nice guy. I think the thing that has struck me, having kind of been, interviewed him and also now I think just becoming friends, he has taken so much from the establishment in this country for 30 years. And I mean, it has been constant. And some of the stuff that has happened to him, I know for a fact people would be shocked, but he's not even talked about it because, it's been so below the belt and has been really low stuff. But the determination to keep going, no matter what, and to do that where there are no real upsides for you personally, just getting up every day and being attacked, being mocked, being criticized, your safety actually being under serious threat, is stuff that you don't see very often. And I think what's behind that is character. And character is not something that we talk a lot about in politics, but I think that's what it comes down to. I think Nigel has a lot of character, and I think he is very, very determined to keep going until he changes, or until he sees the changes that he wants to see. And he's underestimated. Consistently, he has been the most underestimated politician in British politics. I think he's cleverer than most people in Westminster. I think his political instincts are sharper than most people's in Westminster. I think he has a lot more life experience and work experience than a lot of people in Westminster. And I think he sees the bigger picture now. And I think Trump has been helpful in that regard. I think spending so much time in America has been really helpful for him, because it's allowed him to step back and see the bigger picture, to see, what does it take to really take over a political system? What do you need? You need that team. You don't just need that one person. You need the team of people. And for the first time over the last 6 months, I think, listening closely to the things that he says in speeches and so on, I can see in him an understanding that he could get there. He could get to the top of Everest, but he's going to need to be there with a team of people. I think that's really important, because if this thing becomes just a little bit wider, and you start to say, okay, we've got to go from 14% to 30%, that's kind of Reform's big goal. They've got to go from 14 to 30. If you get the right people around with the right experience, and this could be the hottest political movement, that we've had in this country since New Labour.
As with any political party, there are criticisms on both sides, I think. And one I'm concerned about, though I don't know very much about, so I speak as a layperson, but while wanting to stop immigration and try to sort of get this country back to where it was, I wouldn't want to overstep too many maybe liberal boundaries or illiberal boundaries. And there was something I remember reading which put me off voting for Reform last time around, which was around immigrants who are already here, who have been here for some time, would have to do things like pay different amounts for the NHS and things like that, which it put me off, because I thought, well, hang on, that, they're already here. Maybe they're, I don't know. It didn't feel right to me. Do you know about that?
I don't know too much about that. I know that we should certainly have an expectation that people coming into the country have to contribute to public services and the collective pot. I think that's what binds the social contract. What irritates and frustrates many people in Britain today is, for example, that we're paying £5.4 billion a year to sustain hundreds of thousands of people who have broken laws to enter the country illegally, who immediately on arrival are given a cash card, a smartphone, private healthcare, a place in school for their children, housing and accommodation. Now, genuine refugees who come through legal pathways, I don't think anybody in this country, has a problem in saying we'll support genuine refugees who come through the proper pathways. Where I think that British sense of fair play has been violated is when people have been looking at the small boats as an example and saying, well, hang on, we're just taking winter fuel payments of British pensioners to save 1.5 billion. We've just smashed family farms up and down this country to save 500 million. So let's say there's 2 billion there, but we're spending 5.4 billion every year on a broken asylum system, which our two big parties refuse to fix. That's not right. It's not fair. It's outrageous. And if you look at the numbers since 2018, we've spent as a country about 18 billion on the illegal migration crisis. So, the British people are fair and tolerant up until a point where they feel that sense of fairness and fair play is being taken for granted. And they are tolerant and they are fair, but they're also a strong people. And we ask that people play by the rules, because we do. And so do people who migrated into Britain 20, 30, 40 years ago. A lot of people that come up and speak to me on the street are often from minority backgrounds who are saying, well, we came and we play by the rules. So what on earth's going on with the borders? And I think it's that sense of unfairness that runs through a lot of this. And a sense that Labour and the Tories are just not really serious on this issue.
But it's those migrants I would just want to make sure that they don't get punished. The ones who have been here 30, 40 years, they've paid their taxes, they've paid their dues, and now they have to pay higher brackets. I don't know that's the plan.
If people are playing by the rules, they're respecting our laws, they're respecting our ways of life, they're contributing to the collective pot, and they're not, wanting to deconstruct our civilization and repudiate our identity and our ways of life, and they're not breaking the rule of law. I don't think many British people have any problem at all with people who live their lives in that way. And we need to get back to reinforcing what it is that makes our society. What is it that makes us and us, to put it another way? And the idea that people who are here are not contributing is unsustainable.
On the other side, there are people who are critical of reform now, who say that maybe they believe Farage is cozying up to Starmer, that he's not as serious anymore about stopping immigration. What do you say? Have you heard those murmurings?
Yeah, I've seen some of that criticism, but I think there are two things I would say. The first is those people often do not really know the people they're writing about and the movement they're writing about. And the second thing I would say is, if you want to save your country or you want to take Britain back, it seems a very curious strategy to me to appeal to 5% of the country at maximum, right? 5% who want to
deport,
deport legal migrants, or view Nigel Farage as a sellout to Keir Starmer, which is a bizarre line of attack, as opposed to thinking much more seriously about, well, how do you go from 14% to 30%? Because if you want to save your nation, that's what it's going to take. Like, that's the reality. We are, I'm a pragmatist when it comes to politics. There is no such thing as a perfect political movement. There is no such thing as a perfect political leader. All you have in politics are tools that you can use to try and achieve your end goal. That's all you have. So which tool do you want to use? Do you want to use the Labour Party? Do you want to use the Tories? Do you want to use reform? And that's fundamentally how I look at politics. I don't think I look at any political party and say, that is 100% the party that's got everything right and I can't see any issue with it at all. I just think, what's the most useful and effective tool for ending the managed decline of my nation? I think it's this one. I'm going to use this one. And I'm going to think about, how can this one get to 30% instead of arguing about stuff that often doesn't matter with people who, to be honest, spend way too much of their time online and aren't really out there in the real world talking to ordinary people. And I think in that sense, social media has not been great for politics. It happens on the left and the right. People go so far down the echo chamber that they sort of lose touch with the average voter and what the average voter is perceiving. And I would say, let's just engage in a bit of a reality check.
Should we have mandatory voting?
I'm not a fan of mandatory voting. I'm not a fan of any top-down sort of state control that says, you must do this. If people don't want to vote, they don't want to vote. But I would hope that at 28, 29, whenever we have the next election, maybe sooner, I would hope that people feel, like with Brexit, if the offer is compelling enough, people will participate. The reason we voted for Brexit in the end was because 2.5 million people who didn't usually vote came into the system and voted for leave. 28, 29 could be the same thing. Reform, by the way, is the most popular party among non-voters, like by a mile. It's also more popular than the Tories among men. It's more popular than the Tories among everybody under 65.
So imagine mandatory voting then. I mean,
I just don't think mandatory vote. I'm not a fan of top-down state control. Anything that says you must do this, I'm not a fan of.
But you could have abstain on the vote. Like you have to push
maybe, but I don't think personally that's the British way. I think, I believe in individual liberty. If you don't want to vote, don't vote, but then don't sit around complaining about how you don't like what's happening to the country. Because if you don't like what's happening to the country, register to vote and vote.
The reason I put that forward is because of the sectarian silos of Islamism. There's imams who are pushing people in the community to vote a particular way, and those who are not religious, those who are secular, those who they don't have anybody saying you've got to vote in that way. And I just think maybe we need a slightly illiberal way of saying, here's the, you can still push abstain, you can still click abstain or whatever it is, but it's the only way to maybe to combat that.
I don't think that's the only way of combating that. I think you can combat a lot of that in the battle of ideas and by pushing forward alternative movements that are willing to address those issues. I don't think top-down mandatory voting is something I would be supportive of.
What's Tommy Robinson in prison for? It's libel, isn't it, or something?
From my knowledge, showing a documentary that he'd been told not to show and that had violated some sort of court proceeding.
This was another, I was saying before that it's frustrating because there doesn't seem to ever be a point where people say, you know what, sorry, I was right, you guys had that right. Because Tommy was saying 20 years ago stuff that seemed mental at the time to a lot of maybe, again, moderate people, that now people are reevaluating and going, bloody hell. What's your view on Tommy Robinson?
So I think it's certainly true that Tommy Robinson, among other people, was one of the first to talk about issues like the child sexual exploitation scandal or the grooming gang scandal in areas like Luton, but also many other northern towns. But I also think it's true that he didn't help his cause in the way that he campaigned on that issue. Fundamentally, Tommy Robinson would not be a significant political figure, which he is, were it not for the failures of the British state and the established class in Westminster when it came to the issue of the grooming gangs. Had the political establishment addressed that issue and dealt with that issue head on, as they should have done, as every report, every independent government report has made clear since. They didn't want to do it because they thought it would be seen as racist, and they were too scared, and they consistently dodged the issue from Rochdale and Rotherham to Oxford. Had we dealt with that issue head on, you probably would not have seen Tommy Robinson become a significant political figure. You probably would not have seen before him Nick Griffin and the British National Party become a significant a political force, which for a moment they were. And it's all of this stuff, there's first order problems and second order problems in politics. Second order problems, mass immigration, grooming gangs, failures of multiculturalism, etc. The first order problem is the state and the people who govern our political system. And if they had done a better job at managing these issues and actually listening to ordinary people, like they're refusing to listen to them now today over mass migration, then political figures like Tommy Robinson wouldn't have the following that they have.
I've got one more question for you, but first, where can people find your work?
You find me on Substack, mattgoodwin.org, and Twitter, X, YouTube, Instagram, all the usual stuff.
Who is a heretic you admire?
Currently?
Yeah, or whatever you want.
Well, currently I'm kind of falling over myself looking at the radical transformation of Argentina under Milei. I think this is really, challenging the zeitgeist and challenging the established consensus. Mm-hmm. And I think if you go back to some of the early coverage, that this guy was insane, he didn't know what he was doing. There's a crossover to Britain too here, which is an important point. And again, at the heart of this podcast, and why I like coming on this show and supporting it, because it's part of the ecosystem about challenging ideas and challenging groupthink. It's that what you're seeing from Argentina to Trump, El Salvador, among other places, is you're seeing the emergence of politicians who are giving us proof of concept that you can challenge the groupthink and the political establishment and come out the other side having clear wins and showing clear benefits to your society. We have to get to that same point in the UK. Liz Truss tried and failed for different reasons, partly some related to her, some related to the state. But we have to shake Britain out of this slumber, this kind of big tax, big regulation, big borrowing, big debt, big immigration, big woke consensus, which is basically embraced by left and right. So we need some heretics in British politics, and they might not be perfect. You might look at them and say, well, I changed this, this, and this. But we need some heretics who will take on this broken consensus in Westminster and say, this isn't working for ordinary people.
I'm going to Argentina in a few days, actually. My in-laws are there. And it was very exciting when I'm often there. Very exciting when he got in.
Would you call him a heretic? Would you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, he went around with a chainsaw because he was going to break up the.
We should do that in Westminster.
Yeah,
because the difference is we can only change, I think, about 100 or so appointments. It's not like America where you can change tens of thousands.
He ripped up the whole thing. I mean, he's a president. It's a different thing, isn't it? But he's eccentric. I think his dog told him to be president. Unless I'm falling for left wing propaganda about him, I think his dog told him in his dream to be president. He cloned his dog 5 times. He went to America and cloned them. I think he's a cosplayer. This guy is like a real interesting guy. I'm desperate to interview him.
How does it feel when you're there on the ground?
I haven't been there for long. I mean, I was last there when he just got in. I was there while he got in, and this is the first time back. But I was living there for 6 years before him, and it's probably the thing that first woke me up, living in Argentina, to wokeness and but mainly leftism and the problems thereof. Because my God, I mean, they have some wonderful, intelligent people. They've got an amazing landmass with pretty much everything. They should be smashing it economically. And there was just this feeling of just like any kind of challenger, Uber, Amazon, any of these companies, like no, they're protecting the local people against that. So there was no oomph. Yeah. Nobody would ever. They were just like, well, and I would say to the taxi drivers, maybe you guys have got to do better, or maybe to anyone, like if you don't, international competition, that's going to raise you up. And they were just, no, and it didn't happen. And then suddenly this guy comes in, and I think there was also, people weren't paying taxes. They don't pay taxes in Argentina. Every few years they have this thing. It's called like a whitening or something.
Yeah,
do you know what? Yeah, where you can like officially declare your taxes and then you're okay, but no one does because no one else does. Yeah. It's a mess of leftism. And of course they've had the right as well. I mean, my in-laws grew up under a right-wing dictatorship. Sure. So it's just a mad place. But yeah, breath of fresh air, and hopefully he'll keep going. And if you happen to have any contacts, I'd love to I want to interview him, and I can't get hold of him. So
well, hopefully we'll get the breath of fresh air here too.
We shall see. People, please do go and follow Matt Goodwin. Has it got a name, the Substack?
It's just Matt Goodwin Substack. I'll find it. Yeah, we've got about 64,000 people now with us from 173 countries.
It's one of the best and most informed Substacks there is. It's one of the biggest in as you say, in the country. Please, it will be in a link below. Go and click it, hit that like button, and keep watching this channel.